Okay, so let's get started with the fifth commandment, and we're calling this one Ordained Authority. And we will look first at Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12, where it says, "Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." So today this is all about authority and the fact that God loves authority. Question 104 of the Heidelberg Catechism asks, what does God require in the fifth commandment? And the answer is that I show all honor, love, faithfulness to my father and mother, and to all in authority over me. Submit myself with due obedience to all their good instruction and correction, and also bear patiently with their infirmities, since it is God's will to govern us by their hand. Well, the three sections that they roughly correspond to the answer here. We're going to go this way, from the inward heart of toward that ordained authority, to outward conformity to that ordained authority, to finally what I'm going to call the patient duration of that ordained authority. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to it. Let's look first at the inward heart. And what we want to say here is that father and mother say something about God. Now, you remember that fundamental maxim of biblical ethics, namely that we do what we do because of what it says about God and not because of what it says about any lesser thing, including ourselves. And so when God designs a thing, he does so to speak about himself. When God commands a thing, he does so that action would tell the truth about him. And so when God created parents, guess what God was doing there too? Same thing. In a prayer of Paul in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14 and 15, and you should turn there because this is well worth looking at. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, where Paul says, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named." Now, this is one of those cases where the Greek actually is illuminating for us. And you'll notice, you don't see this in English, but the word pater in the Greek for father, well, that word family, patria. And that's not just a superficial similarity, but what, I guess, similar to a bunch of people living around your house, we would call that a neighborhood. Well, this thing that is called a family is literally a fatherhood. And what we're going to see is that has to do with authorship. Speaking of a little etymology, those words, authority and author, come from the same Latin word, auctor. And so that's what's going on here. God designed parents, and he did so with fathers at the head to speak of his own fatherhood. That's what he means by they're named after the father. And the mother being placed under that headship of the father, children need to know that disrespect of mother on that account is an insult to the father as well, as she is called his image by Paul, and his glory in 1 Corinthians 11:7. Every bit as much as they both image God, nevertheless, the woman is called the glory of the man. You notice that? And so there's a reason why that would be so disrespectful. Now, the heart is talked about here. Notice the catechism answer: honor, love, faithfulness. This begins in the heart. Calvin says of such a heart attitude in the child that they should regard them with reverence. And naturally, we can look at that and say, if we're children, God can't command that of me. My parents won't know one way or another if I highly esteem them. And that might be true as to your true feelings. But you know very well that God knows what your true feelings toward your parents are. And the first feeling ought to be that of gratitude, since our fathers and mothers lovingly brought us from being the weakest of all creatures to being conscious and mature. And though we hardly give it a single thought, they too had independent dreams and aspirations, and then they were set on a different course of self-sacrifice, not unwillingly, but out of love. And that gratitude ought to be accompanied by a desire to please our parents. Proverbs 15:20. A wise son makes a glad father. And so a good child is a child who is glad that they make their parents glad. Now, parental authority, in the whole Reformed tradition, we'll see this, and this is true in both the Westminster and the Heidelberg, it is seen as a nursery of all of life honor. God himself is governing us by these authorities. In fact, you think of it this way: the first table of the law, the second table of the law, just like the first commandment was foundational for religion, so the fifth commandment, that first one in the second table, is foundational for ethics. And why is that? It's because the family is the fundamental social unit for the rest of society. As the home goes, so goes the rest of society. Now, God himself is governing us by these authorities. As question 104 ends, Paul even cites the civil magistrate in Romans 13:4 in this way: God's servant for your good. And at the end of that text, the apostle adds in verse 7, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Now, why? I mean, the guy that was in charge, and Paul wrote that, was Nero. And he knew very well that just if we act good, therefore Caesar's going to bless me. Well, it's clearly not what he meant. Paul was martyred by that same Nero just a couple years later. It's about the office. Let's start to build this idea. Charles Hodge, in his systematic theology, gives us a glimpse of what we might mean by authority being a lens of God's glory. He says about our duty toward authority, quote, it matters not in what their superiority consists, whether in age, office, power, knowledge, or excellence, end quote. Now, think about those just for a second. Age, office, power, knowledge, or some other excellence. All of those are ordained by God. God places others in our lives, those who are older, and so they have life experience to offer us, those who have greater degrees of power or knowledge that are decisive for some task together, or others who are simply in the office, even though we may say, how did they get there? I should be there, or something like that. But God put them there, and God gave them those qualities. But God has those qualities. Remember that maxim. He has sovereign rule. He has all knowledge and all power. He has wisdom to rule well. And he has a just care that all things line up on the job, so to speak. The display of those divine attributes and those divine priorities are always at stake in all of those positions, in all of those qualities, in every human authority. Parents are our first and formative school in God's authorship of the story. We may play a prominent role, we may have many parts, but we must never grab for the pen out of the scriptwriter's hands. Authority is all about authorship. And the question is, whose story are you content to tell? Objection 1, and maybe you have this objection. But my parents, or my boss, my elder, my governor, whatever it is, he's not an honorable person. And some may even add to that, no, you don't understand. My father, or my teacher, or my boss is a wicked master. Well, my reply to that is, again, we do what we do because of what it says about God, not because of what it says about any lesser thing. And that is reason enough for the honor to be due. It is the office that reflects God, not the particular personality, not the particular performance of the person in it, but the office. And so, for example, when Noah in Genesis 9 drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent, And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. The connotation in that text, though it is not explicit, is clearly that there was flippancy and maybe even verbal mockery that was going on. Otherwise, it just doesn't make any sense, the curse. But it says, Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done, and said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Noah sinned a shameful sin. And yet God's word honors that curse. Why is that? It's because of what it said about God. It's because of what it said about his fatherhood. Well, that's the heart. That's what we have to know in here. Now we move outward to outward conformity. Such a heart honors in the world for all to see. In other words, a good child strives to make his parents look good, and a faithful worker and a church member likewise has a care to the visible image of God, of their employer, or of their elders. You know, one verse that might strike us as very, very harsh in the Old Testament comes from Exodus 21:17, and you see a little bit of this in Leviticus 20, verse 9 as well, and that is that whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. I said at first that God loves authority. Well, there's a flip side to that coin. God hates rebellion. As Luther said after the Peasants' Revolt of 1525, that, quote, there is nothing more poisonous, noxious, and utterly devilish than a rebel. Now, we're going to make distinctions between proper submissive disagreement in a home, peaceable dissent among church members, even civil disobedience. They all have a place. But pure rebellion, because you might, how do I tell the difference? And there's all sorts of ways to address that question. But one of them is to just get a sense of what's meant by pure rebellion. A rebellion against the design per se, against the story, against the authorship. Let's face it, that's really what's behind egalitarianism, feminism in the church. That's not a simple, humble disposition that asks questions or even that disagrees or must at some point say no, but is going to the root of the design itself. And so, in that sense, Luther was absolutely right. And so to prevent God's people from turning into devils, you get these strictest boundaries in the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 21:18 is another one. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives, and they shall say to the elders of his city, This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Now first notice his age. He was a drunkard and a glutton. This is not a tender child. It makes the point to say that though they had disciplined him, the implication is that it's the end of a journey. Okay? This is a rebellious man that did not leave the home, would not be an image and take dominion out there after his parents, who, from indication, they were faithful. But even so, it wasn't a tender child. So why? Why the stoning? Well, because just as the punishment of Nadab and Abihu in the Leviticus 10, if you're familiar with that, for perverting God's worship, that was not harsh because of what was at stake. So is a microcosm of God's temple, the earthly home, must sanctify God's ordained authority because of what it says about God. Now for parents, we have a part. Things like first-time obedience. That perfect submission needs that, and our children need us to help them there. When we count, when we delay the discipline moment, we give room to rebellion. And that is a reminder that the parents help children's obedience. Just like all the other commandments, we help each other proactively. We don't put stumbling blocks for each other. Now, As the object, this is important in all the commandments, the object of the second table of the law is always the image of God. And so disobedience in all these commandments, 5 through 10, is violence to that image. And here in the fifth commandment, that would mean violence against the image's authority. Now, the violence of disobedience is a lot easier to see, I think, for the sixth through the eighth commandment, his life, his marriage, his property. You can see that contact. It's easier to see. You can see it a little bit with the ninth and 10th as well. But to commit violence against the image of an authority, does our generation even have any categories for that? Is that even a thing? Well, let's ask. Does the author have a script? Does the coach have a play? Does the general have a strategy? And does the growing child even care? The issue is authority. And we need to positively cast that vision so that what can come into view is the authorship of the image. The idea of all their good instruction and correction is the last phrase that we'll look at here. This can be taken in two different ways, and so we want to flip the coin here on both sides and see what's going on here. All their good instruction and correction. And here let's just take it in the first way. Namely that the office of instruction and correction is itself a good. The office, no matter what their performance, no matter what their personality, no matter how dishonorable, the office itself. Whether the particular rules or counsel is good and wise and just and compelling, we can always find a better. We can always say, I could do that better than him, or I can look into the history books, or I can podcast a better pastor. Whatever it is, we can always find a better. But this is not fundamentally why we pay honor. And so Peter tells servants in 1 Peter 2:18 to be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. And so here, the good is that design of God. That is the office of authority. We honor that because of what it says about God. So all their good instruction and correction, even in spite if they don't give that, the office is for that, and we want the story to go out. Third, the patient duration of ordained authority. Again, I said all their good instruction and correction be taken in two ways. Well, now we come to the second meaning, namely that kind that is qualified. And so we recognize that obedience is rendered to the degree that the command from the man does not absolutely violate that first commandment from God. And I say first commandment because any number of sins can be committed by that authority. But we're gonna ask ourselves, where do you draw the line? In the Bible, here's the first principle. In the Bible, there is only one to whom the Christian is to give unqualified obedience every time, and that is to God himself. Calvin understands the clause in Ephesians 6:1, in the Lord, to indicate that, quote, if a father enjoins anything unrighteous, obedience is freely to be denied him. So it's not, naturally, it's very unfitting for children to be the arbiters of, well, daddy sinned here. Well, does this measure up to Scripture and so on? And we can nitpick, and we can say, is this an essential or is it not? I mean, is it daddy saying, come on, kids, we're going to join a cult today? That's obviously different than other lesser things. And so even when it comes to adults asking this question about authorities, we have to be realistic about the whole of what God has called us to in covenant with other people, and asking what's essential and what's not. Because in general, Jesus gives us a cross to bear, and that includes mistreatment from others, to a degree, within a sphere. 1 Peter 2:21 through 23, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So, as a norm, there is a good in bearing up under bad. Not to come across too simplistically here, but the words last resort certainly come to mind here. But that still doesn't answer the question. What's the last resort? Where do we draw the line? Because even this last resort or line can be badly misunderstood. And I've done this in the class just recently with the coin in Matthew 22:17 through 21. That these are not heads and tails are like worlds apart. If it's Caesar's, it's not Christ's. If it's Christ's, it's not Caesar's. Now, Caesar's completely inside of the circle of Christ. All things belong to King Jesus. Some of those same things have been delegated down to Caesar. And you see that in every authority submission institution passage in the New Testament. Submit to this, put up with this, obey this in the Lord, for the Lord's sake, as unto the Lord. It's not an escape hatch. It's not a loophole. That is a recognition that Christ alone is the ultimate authority, which immediately sets you up for the fact that the other authorities are delegated and therefore provisional, qualified. Now, disobedience to ordained authority is only for when they command direct disobedience to God. And this is about essentials. This is never taken lightly. But neither should we be naive about its frequency. You hear this all the time. So, for example, everybody knows that Acts 4 is in the Bible. There's Peter and John. Acts 4:19 through 20. Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. What's the takeaway for a lot of people today? Well, it's not until they start stopping us from preaching the gospel. First of all, there's a lot of things that stop you from preaching the gospel than you may think. You try to opt out of politics. Politics has a way of showing up with its blue helmet on your front door, especially about the things of religion. So don't be naive. But in addition to that, of course, we've seen that they can command the exact opposite to God. We saw it in the first table of the law. So they say, don't gather. God says gather. That's the fourth commandment. That is absolutely not up for grabs. Now, short of such covenant-breaking violence, our godly disposition bears patiently with their infirmities. And back to the home now, we have to understand that there is a gracious incompetence clause, so to speak. The author of Hebrews, for example, treats earthly fathers in Hebrews 12 as God's bungling tutors. Not that this ever excuses any level of incompetence, much less any kind of abuse. But he does say, in Hebrews 12:9 and 10, besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? See, there's an analogy there. For they, earthly fathers, for they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. What's happening here? The Reformed tradition is right. Not only is the home that school of all of life, obedience and authority, but the whole thing is making us obedient to God. So there's a good in it, even when they get it wrong. And this reminds us again of the parent side of this commandment. As one theologian said, many duties are of a reciprocal nature. Thus, the duties of inferiors imply the reciprocal duties of superiors. That's why in Ephesians 6, Paul ends this section telling fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. You see, that's a portion of the fifth. Parents are to obey the fifth commandment too, in relation to their children. Not by obeying them, but by helping them obey the parental authority. All right, let's talk about those three uses of the law. First, the civil. Again, there's a universal consensus in the Reformed tradition that the fifth commandment was rooted in parental authority in the home, and that was a school for the social authority at large. Biblical examples abound. so that we're not left to simply precept and making inferences. One of my favorite examples is David in 1 Samuel 24. David was the true anointed, and Saul was a tyrant. There's no confusion about that as you read the text. But rather than kill them off in his own time, you remember the story. Saul is hunting him down. Saul finds him, but Saul had to go relieve himself. And so he went into the cave. David's men, they had him, and they were egging him on, saying, kill him. Now, but what does David say? I will not touch the Lord's anointed. He cuts off a part of his robe, brings it to the top of the cave, and calls down to him. And Saul's already convicted, but 1 Samuel 24, verse 12, what does David say beyond that? He doesn't just say, I won't touch you. He says more than that. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you. But my hand shall not be against you. Proper channels, proper tone and disposition, proper timing, due authority. There's all sorts of ways and right elements that must be there when a covenant breaks down because its authority becomes a tyrant and an abuser or abandons or something like that. And we don't just take that lightly. But on the other hand, don't fall to the other extreme. The covenant breaking by that authority being a fraud and a tyrant is a real thing. And so as that dissolves for some other man and group of men in some cases to step up. And so the dilemma of civil disobedience gets thicker in places where the Christian has less freedom to legally check power. Christians in places like California, Illinois, New York, or other blue states, or Canada, or Europe. You know, we don't want to give this one-size-fits-all flippant approach to it. We've got to do this, and they can't do like 90% of that. Okay, there's no condemnation there. This is where Jesus calls us all to be as wise as serpents, as innocent as doves in Matthew 10:16. And so battles have to be chosen wisely. Preach the gospel. Save as many as can be saved. But for many, there is wisdom in getting one's house in order for possibly an eventual move to freer pastures. Not everybody is called out, but neither is everyone called to stay either. It may be time, there may be a time soon, for the majority to fall back to Helm's Deep, so to speak, to push back against Babylon from a position of greater strength. And there's precedence in that in history. That's why some people came over here called the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And that flight is no dishonor to real authority or unity. Calvin fled. Knox fled. Many, many other reformers did. And so just have that in mind. This call to ordained authority is not a call to stay in an abusive relationship at any level of society. The directive use of the law. If I'm a child who says, yes, I follow Jesus, how do I best honor and obey my father and my mother? There's a lot of ways we can answer that in very concrete, like that first time obedience. But one thing we really want to press is motive. Notice from the Ephesians 6:1 passage and Colossians 3:20 that this commandment is still abiding in the New Testament. And it's one more evidence of it being moral law. But the Ephesians passage is especially interesting because the promise, you'll notice, is also reiterated. Which is interesting because no Gentile Christian is being promised long life in the land of Canaan, right? So obviously it's typological. But typological for what? He brings across the promise. And so here's another thing it's not a guarantee of literal long life here. Many of the purest of saints died young. I think of Lady Jane Grey or David Brainerd or Robert Murray McShane or Jim Elliot, many, many others. The issue is this: honor begets influence. Living long in the land, in a real land, in this lifetime. But you get that right in the home. You learn how to obey. You learn how to be diligent. You learn how to be tough under that authority that maybe you disagree with, but the patience and endurance, it builds something that's with you in the rest of life. And that if you don't have that, if there's no father at all, but certainly if you rebel against that, that's going to have massive implications across society and life. And finally, the evangelical use of the law. In Paul's list of the most terrible sins that typify the human race under wrath in Romans 1, he lists this: disobedient to parents. And it's really one of the great uses of the law for younger children, of all the things we're supposed to do, and yet we fail in. And we're not talking about pressing this in some, discouragement fest. But if we're proactive in explaining that positive vision, casting a vision of authority, that God has us, God has our home on a mission. And Proverbs 23:24 says, "The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice. He who fathers a wise son will be glad in him." Well, you know who really obeyed the fifth commandment? Jesus Christ did. And think of the words of that proverb. Jesus Christ. You see, God the Father is the Father of that righteous one. He has made him glad. And because he did that in our place, we now make the Father glad as well. So we'll wrap up there, and we'll pick it up on the sixth commandment next time.